kindness is a conscious strength, not a passive trait, because it arises from awareness rather than instinct, choice rather than avoidance. A passive trait is something that exists without effort, like a reflex or habit formed through repetition. Kindness, however, requires presence. It demands perception, emotional intelligence, and the ability to regulate one's inner world before responding to the outer one. To be kind is not to simply react softly. It is to recognize complexity and still choose humanity. True kindness begins with self-mastery. A person who is overwhelmed by their impulses, fears, or unresolved emotions cannot consistently act with genuine kindness. They may appear agreeable, polite, or non-confrontational, but these behaviors often come from fear of conflict rather than inner strength. Conscious kindness, by contrast, emerges when someone has faced their own anger, insecurity, and desire for control, and has learned not to be ruled by them. It is strength because it reflects inner order. Kindness requires courage. It takes courage to listen without interrupting, to understand without immediately defending, to show patience when irritation would be easier. These are not weak acts. They require restraint, and restraint is one of the highest forms of power. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can withdraw. It takes discipline to remain open while remaining intact. This is why kindness is often misunderstood. From the outside, restraint looks like softness. Silence looks like submission. Calm looks like compliance. But these interpretations come from those who equate power with dominance. In reality, dominance is often compensation for inner chaos, while kindness is the result of integration. A person who knows they could harm but chooses not to is not weak. They are controlled. Conscious kindness also involves discernment. It is not indiscriminate. It does not flow endlessly in all directions without awareness of consequence. Passive niceness says yes. Automatically, conscious kindness pauses. It evaluates. It considers both the other person and the self. This pause is not hesitation born of fear, but intention born of clarity. It allows kindness to be sustainable rather than self-erasing. Many people confuse kindness with the absence of boundaries. This confusion leads to exhaustion and resentment. When kindness is offered without limits, it becomes a form of self-neglect. But when it is guided by self-respect, it becomes stable. Boundaries do not contradict kindness, they protect it. They ensure that compassion does not turn into martyrdom. Kindness also requires an understanding of human nature. People project their inner states onto others. When someone encounters conscious kindness, they may respond with gratitude, but they may also respond with entitlement or exploitation. This reaction says more about their inner world than about the kind person. Strength is required not to internalize these projections, not to reshape oneself to fit someone else's unresolved needs. A consciously kind person accepts that not everyone will understand them. They do not perform kindness to be liked or approved of. They act from alignment, not from a need for validation. This independence is what makes kindness powerful. It is given freely, not traded for safety or acceptance. Kindness also involves truth. Avoiding honesty to keep peace is not kindness, it is avoidance. Conscious kindness can speak difficult truths without cruelty. It can disappoint without guilt. It can say no without hostility. This capacity comes only from inner grounding. A passive person avoids conflict because they fear rejection. A strong, kind person engages when necessary because they value integrity. There is also a quiet discipline in kindness that often goes unseen. Choosing empathy when one is misunderstood. Choosing patience when one is provoked. Choosing dignity when one could easily retaliate. These choices accumulate. Over time, they form character. Character is not loud, but it is resilient. Kindness becomes weakness only when it is disconnected from awareness. When someone gives to avoid discomfort, to maintain an image, or to escape their own needs, their kindness drains them. But when kindness is rooted in consciousness, it replenishes. It aligns action with values. It allows a person to remain humane without becoming hollow. This is why kindness should never be framed as something that happens to a person, as if they are simply born gentle or accommodating. Kindness is cultivated. It is refined through reflection, failure, and self-knowledge. It is a position one takes in the world, not a role one is trapped in. A consciously kind person does not confuse compassion with self-sacrifice. They understand that respecting themselves teaches others how to treat them. Their kindness carries weight because it is not desperate, not automatic, not negotiable. Kindness, when chosen with awareness, becomes a form of quiet authority. It reshapes interactions, reveals intentions, and establishes psychological presence. It is not passive because it is not unconscious. It is not weakness because it does not abandon the self. It stands firm, attentive, and deliberate, rooted in the understanding that true strength does not need to announce itself. It simply remains steady in the face of pressure, misunderstanding, and temptation to harden, choosing again and again to stay human. Without surrendering its center, unintegrated kindness invites projection from others because anything that remains unconscious within a person becomes an open surface onto which others can place their unmet needs, unresolved conflicts, and denied impulses. Kindness that has not been integrated with self-knowledge, boundaries. An inner authority does not appear as strength to the outside world. It appears as availability. And availability, when undefined, becomes a psychological invitation. Projection occurs when individuals disown parts of themselves they cannot tolerate and locate them in someone else. Responsibility, emotional regulation, empathy, and restraint are often qualities people admire but have not cultivated within themselves. When they encounter someone who naturally embodies these qualities, especially kindness, they experience both attraction and relief. Instead of developing these traits internally, they lean on the kind person to carry them. Unintegrated kindness lacks structure. It gives without assessing cost. It listens without deciding when to stop. It forgives without requiring change. This absence of internal limits creates a vacuum. Others unconsciously sense this vacuum and fill it with expectations. The kind person becomes the emotional container for what others refuse to hold themselves. This is why unintegrated kindness is rarely met with reciprocity. People do not value what they receive without effort. When kindness flows without discernment, it is interpreted as natural abundance rather than conscious choice. The recipient assumes it will always be there because nothing signals that it could be withdrawn. Projection thrives in this space. The other person begins to see the kind individual not as a separate psyche with limits, but as a function, a listener, a fixer, a stabilizer, a source of calm. The more the kind person accepts this role without resistance, the more rigid the projection becomes. Over time, the projected role replaces reality. The kind person is no longer allowed complexity. Anger surprises people. Fatigue disappoints them. Boundaries feel like betrayal. This reaction reveals the projection clearly. The other person was never related to the individual, but to the psychological role they assigned them. Unintegrated kindness often stems from early adaptation. Many people learn to be kind as a survival strategy. They become attuned to others' emotions to maintain harmony or avoid rejection. This form of kindness is reactive rather than chosen. It feels moral, but it is rooted in fear because it is not integrated with self-assertion. It attracts those who seek emotional outsourcing. Those who project onto kind people often struggle with their own shadow qualities. They avoid responsibility, suppress aggression, or deny vulnerability. Encountering someone who seems endlessly patient and understanding allows them to remain unconscious. The kind person absorbs the emotional labor, allowing the other to stay unchanged. This dynamic is not sustained by malice, but by imbalance. The unintegrated kind person unconsciously agrees to carry more than their share. They confuse endurance with virtue. They believe that being understanding will eventually be seen and appreciated. Instead, it becomes expected. Projection intensifies when kindness is paired with silence. When the kind person does not articulate their needs or discomfort, others fill in the blanks. They assume consent where there is only tolerance. They mistake emotional generosity for emotional obligation. Integration changes everything. Integrated kindness includes the awareness of one's limits, the capacity to assert them, and the willingness to disrupt comfort to preserve integrity. When kindness is integrated, it no longer absorbs projections. It reflects them back. A person with integrated kindness does not allow themselves to become a psychological dumping ground. They notice when they are being leaned on rather than met. They sense when appreciation turns into entitlement. Their kindness remains present, but it is no longer passive. Projection dissolves in the presence of integration because clarity replaces ambiguity. Others can no longer pretend the kind person exists only to serve. The relationship must either mature into mutual responsibility or collapse under the weight of reality. Unintegrated kindness invites projection because it leaves too much unsaid. Integrated kindness speaks through boundaries, timing, and discernment. It reveals that kindness is not an endless resource to be consumed, but a conscious engagement offered freely and withdrawn when misused. This does not make kindness conditional. It makes it honest. It allows kindness to exist alongside firmness, alongside refusal, alongside self-protection. Without this balance, kindness becomes a shadow trait, admired but exploited, praised but drained. When kindness is integrated, it ceases to attract projection and begins to attract presence. Others must meet it consciously rather than use it unconsciously. They must relate to a person rather than a role. They must take responsibility for their own inner work instead of outsourcing it. Unintegrated kindness invites projection because it offers light without structure, empathy without grounding, care without containment. Once integrated, kindness becomes whole. And what is whole cannot be easily projected onto, because it stands as itself, clear, defined, and psychologically solid, no longer available to carry what others refuse to face within themselves. People exploit what they do not understand or possess because unfamiliar strength creates discomfort, and discomfort seeks control. When someone encounters a quality they lack internally, especially one that cannot be easily measured or taken by force, the instinctive response is often not admiration but manipulation. Exploitation becomes a way to neutralize what feels threatening or unattainable. What people do not understand, they reduce. What they cannot possess, they attempt to use. This pattern appears wherever there is imbalance between inner development and external behavior. Emotional maturity, self-awareness, patience, depth, and integrity are not visible currencies. They cannot be acquired through imitation alone. When these qualities are encountered in another, especially someone who carries them quietly, they are often misread as softness rather than strength. Misunderstanding creates permission. When a person does not recognize the cost of something, they assume it is cheap. When they do not grasp the discipline behind calmness, they assume it is effortless. When they do not understand the restraint behind kindness, they assume it has no edge. This miscalculation opens the door to exploitation. People exploit what they lack because acquiring it internally would require confronting themselves. It is easier to draw from someone else's stability than to build one's own. It is easier to lean on another's clarity than to face one's own confusion. Exploitation becomes a shortcut, an unconscious strategy to access what feels unreachable through effort. This dynamic is rarely deliberate. Most people do not wake up intending to exploit. They simply gravitate toward those who make their lives easier. The person who listens without judgment becomes the emotional outlet. The person who remains calm becomes the regulator of chaos. The person who forgives becomes the buffer against consequence. Over time, this reliance turns into expectation. The exploiter often believes the other person is naturally suited for the role. They assume this is simply who they are. This belief allows them to avoid guilt. If the kind person is just like that, then taking more does not feel like taking. It feels like receiving what is freely available. What is missing here is understanding. The exploiter does not see the internal effort, the emotional labor, or the boundaries being quietly crossed. They do not see the cost because they have never paid it themselves. As a result, they do not recognize when they are overusing something valuable. Exploitation also arises from envy that cannot be admitted. When someone lacks inner coherence, encountering it in another can provoke resentment. Instead of acknowledging this envy, they diminish the quality. They label it naive, weak, or excessive. This justification makes exploitation feel justified rather than predatory. People are less likely to exploit what they understand deeply. Understanding creates respect. Respect creates restraint. Without understanding, restraint disappears. The person takes not because they are cruel, but because nothing inside them signals that a line has been crossed. Those who exploit often feel entitled to what they lack. They believe life has been unfair, that others owe them support, patience, or forgiveness. When they encounter someone who offers these things, they interpret it as confirmation of this belief. The giver becomes proof that their needs deserve priority. This is why explaining oneself repeatedly rarely stops exploitation. The issue is not communication. It is internal absence. You cannot teach someone to respect the quality they have never cultivated. You can only stop making it available without structure. People exploit what they do not possess because possession requires responsibility. If they were to develop patience, they would have to sit with discomfort. If they were to develop empathy, they would have to feel guilt. If they were to develop integrity, they would have to face inconsistency. Exploitation avoids all of this. The exploited person often participates unconsciously by overgiving. They hope their generosity will be recognized. They believe understanding will inspire change. Instead, it reinforces dependency. The more easily something is accessed, the less it is valued. When the giver begins to withdraw, the exploiter often reacts with confusion or anger. They feel something has been taken from them, even though it was never theirs. This reaction reveals the dynamic clearly. What was framed as kindness is now revealed as a resource that had been quietly consumed. Understanding shifts this dynamic. When a person recognizes the value of what they offer, they naturally protect it. They stop giving automatically and start giving intentionally. This shift disrupts exploitation, not through confrontation, but through clarity. People exploit what they do not understand or possess because it allows them to borrow strength without earning it. But borrowed strength collapses the moment access is removed. What remains is the necessity to face oneself, and it is this moment, when access ends, that reveals whether there was ever a relationship, or only a quiet extraction of something valuable that was never fully seen, never fully respected, and never truly understood without boundaries. Compassion becomes self-betrayal. Because giving without limits slowly erodes the self that is doing the giving. Compassion is meant to connect, not consume. It is meant to soften human experience, not silence one's own needs. When boundaries are absent, compassion loses its groaning and turn inward, transforming care for others into neglect of the self. Boundaries are not walls against compassion. They are the structure that allows it to exist without distortion. A person without boundaries may appear endlessly understanding, endlessly patient, endlessly available, but beneath this appearance often lies fear. Fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as selfish. Compassion offered from fear is no longer a free choice. It becomes an obligation, and obligation drains the spirit. True compassion includes self-recognition. It acknowledges personal limits, emotional capacity, and responsibility to one's own well-being. When these realities are ignored, compassion turns into a performance rather than an authentic expression. The individual continues to give, not because they want to, but because they feel they must. Over time, this creates inner division. One part of the psyche keeps giving, while another part grows resentful and unheard. Self-betrayal begins quietly. It starts with small moments of silence when something feels wrong but is not addressed. It grows through repeated justifications. They need me more. This will pass. I can handle it. Each justification moves the person further away from their own truth. Compassion becomes the language used to excuse. Self-abandonment. Without boundaries, others do not learn restraint. They do not sense where care ends and responsibility begins. They assume availability because nothing signals otherwise. This is not because people are inherently malicious, but because human behavior adjusts to what is permitted. When no limit is expressed, the absence of resistance is interpreted as consent. Compassion without boundaries also distorts relationships. It creates imbalance. One person becomes the giver, the other the receiver. Equality dissolves. The compassionate person carries emotional labor, absorbs tension, and manages outcomes. The other is relieved of growth. Over time, this imbalance breeds quiet contempt on one side and entitlement on the other. Self-betrayal is reinforced when compassion is used to avoid one's own pain. Some people give because it keeps them from looking inward. Focusing on others provides purpose and distraction. But avoidance disguised as compassion still carries a cost. The unmet needs do not disappear. They wait. And when they surface, they often do so as exhaustion, bitterness, or emotional shutdown. Boundaries are acts of honesty. They communicate reality without aggression. They say, this is what I can give and this is where I stop. Without this honesty, compassion becomes misleading. Others believe they are not asking too much because nothing indicates otherwise. The compassionate person then feels misunderstood, but the misunderstanding was created by silence. There is a common fear that boundaries will destroy compassion. In truth, they preserve it. Boundaries prevent burnout. They prevent the hardening that occurs when someone feels used. They allow compassion to remain clean rather than contaminated by resentment. When compassion is bounded, it carries clarity. It does not overextend. It does not rescue. It does not absorb consequences that belong to someone else. It supports growth rather than dependence. This form of compassion respects both parties. Self-betrayal occurs when a person repeatedly acts against their inner knowing in the name of being good. Over time, the psyche registers this as disloyalty, the self learns that its signals will be ignored. This creates fragmentation. The outer self appears kind, while the inner self withdraws. Boundaries repair this split. They reunite compassion with self-respect. They allow a person to remain open without becoming empty. They give kindness weight and direction. Without boundaries, compassion becomes a slow erosion of identity. The person no longer knows where they end and others begin. Their time, energy, and emotions feel constantly invaded. What began as care becomes obligation. What began as love becomes duty. Compassion that includes boundaries does not need to explain itself endlessly. It does not apologize for existing. It stands firm and gentle at the same time. This firmness is not cruelty, it is integrity. Self-betrayal ends the moment compassion is extended inward with the same seriousness it is offered outward. When a person honors their limits, compassion regains its original purpose. It becomes a conscious exchange rather than a silent sacrifice, a shared human gesture rather than a one-sided depletion, and it finally returns to its rightful place as a force that connects without consuming, that gives without disappearing, and that remains rooted in truth rather than obligation. True kindness includes the courage to say no, because without refusal, kindness loses its honesty. A yes that is given out of fear, guilt, or habit is not an act of care, but an act of avoidance. It protects comfort in the moment while slowly eroding integrity. Say no when necessary is to respect reality, and respect is one of the deepest forms of kindness. Many people associate kindness with constant agreement. They believe being good means being accommodating, flexible, and endlessly available. This belief confuses kindness with appeasement. Appeasement seeks to prevent discomfort at any cost, even the cost of the self. Kindness, on the other hand, seeks what is humane and truthful, even when it creates temporary tension. Saying no requires self-awareness. A person must recognize their limits before they can honor them. Limits are not moral failures. They are expressions of capacity. When someone ignores their limits to appear kind, they are not expanding their compassion. They are denying their reality. This denial inevitably leads to fatigue, resentment, and emotional withdrawal. The courage to say no is not aggression. It is clarity. It communicates what can and cannot be given without hostility or explanation. Many kind people struggle with this because they fear rejection or being misunderstood. They worry that refusal will make them appear selfish or cold. In truth, refusal often reveals the health of a relationship. Those who respect you will adjust. Those who rely on your silence will resist. True kindness understands that discomfort is sometimes necessary. Growth often requires frustration. Responsibility often requires disappointment. When a kind person says no, they allow others to encounter reality rather than being shielded from it. This is not cruelty. It is respect for the other person's capacity to handle life. A yes that costs your well-being is not generous. It is unsustainable. Over time, it teaches others that your needs are secondary. It trains them to expect access without consent. Saying no interrupts this pattern. It restores balance and dignity to the interaction. There is also an internal kindness in saying no. It signals self-loyalty. It tells the psyche that its signals matter. Each time someone overrides their inner resistance, they weaken trust with themselves. Each time they honor it, they strengthen inner alignment. This alignment is felt by others, even if it is not consciously understood. Many people who struggle to say no learned early that approval was conditional. They adapted by becoming agreeable. This adaptation may have ensured safety once, but it becomes limiting in adulthood. Kindness rooted in survival is different from kindness rooted in choice. The courage to say no marks the transition from one to the other. True kindness does not need to justify itself excessively. It does not over-explain or apologize for existing. A simple no, offered calmly, carries more respect than a resentful yes. Over-explanation often signals internal conflict rather than consideration. Saying no also preserves the value of yes. When yes is rare and intentional, it carries weight. It becomes meaningful. Others learn that your agreement is not automatic but chosen. This choice deepens trust rather than diminishing it. Kindness that cannot say no becomes predictable. Predictability invites overuse. When people know you will always agree, they stop asking with care. Refusal reintroduces mindfulness into interactions. It requires others to consider impact rather than assumption. True kindness includes the willingness to tolerate misunderstanding. Some people will misinterpret your no as rejection or hostility. This reaction often reveals their dependence on your compliance. Responding with firmness rather than defensiveness allows the truth to stand without escalation. There is strength in allowing others to feel disappointed. Disappointment is not harm. It is a natural part of human interaction. Shielding people from it at your own expense is not kindness. It is imbalance. The courage to say no is also the courage to remain present. Instead of withdrawing or becoming passive-aggressive, a kind person states their limit and stays engaged. This preserves connection while protecting the self. True kindness recognizes that generosity without consent becomes obligation. Obligation drains meaning from care. Saying no restores freedom to kindness. It allows giving to remain voluntary rather than coerced by expectation. In this way, refusal becomes an act of respect. It respects the self by honoring limits. It respects the other by offering honesty. It respects the relationship by preventing hidden resentment. True kindness is not measured by how much one gives, but by how consciously one gives. The courage to say no ensures that kindness remains rooted in choice rather than fear, in truth rather than performance, and in self-respect rather than self-erasure.